form and the optional final. And the week after that, the following Tuesday, I'll have a review sheet for exam 4 and a brief kind of overview of what to look for the optional final should you decide to take that. So again, but we'll worry about that. Right, so for now, I'll go through and look at, again, a little more political geography here. As always, I'm sorry.
Well, when is the final?
Oh gosh, I think it's actually we have the last day of finals week. It's like the 13th or something like that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We drew about the last final on campus, so that'll be 13th, right? My question. All right. So as always, you know the names and dates and things like that on here. As always, it's a big picture, right? So usually it's getting kind of concept and a handful of examples here. So again, one thing we're talking about at the end of class on Thursday, right? We're talking about really that democracy is not doing too terribly well in this region, and historically, democracy is actually been a fairly rare commodity, right? So traditionally, essentially kind of two forms of government in this region. One is the monarchy, right? We've talked about that a little bit on Thursday. Is, as is the case with Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, it's one of the really last major regions on earth where, again, kings and, not kings in this case, but again, where monarchs actually wield real honest to God political power, right? So, as we discussed, Europe has lots of kings, so, England has a queen, Spain has a king, Sweden has a king, Belgium has a king, Japan has an emperor, but they're all mainly symbolic in nature, right? And really one of the last places on earth, the Middle East, where you find kings and queens, again, in this case, mainly kings who wield, again, real honest to God political clout, right? So there's that form of government. We also have, again, authoritarian governments, right? And these come in different varieties, but this is kind of the traditional, again, non-monarchy form of government here. So some examples, if you want to make a note to yourself, I don't expect you to memorize all these examples, but they illustrate the point where the idea that you have, again, these dictatorships or military governments, or these one-party republics, again, that aren't really democracies, largely backed by the United States, usually, again, pro-secular, and pro-secular means what? A government that sort of separates religion from government, right? So the pro-secular, usually pro-Western, favor the interests of the ruling class. And these authoritarian governments are often favored by the United States, right? So the U.S. and other foreign powers. We talked about this as kind of a theme that's running the whole semester here, is that democracy is a messy thing, an unstable thing. You talk to us the most morally righteous form of government, but again, it's messy, right? So again, the foreign powers will often favor these authoritarian governments because of the stability they traditionally provide, right? So some examples here, and again, you don't have to memorize these examples, but Algeria has essentially been run by the military really since independence, right? So they've had brief flirtations with democracy, where they have elections and so on, but again, long periods, decades of martial law, where effectively the military rules outright. If not, they again allow democracy to work its way through Algeria, but will always overthrow any government that sort of again crosses the military. It's kind of similar to what we talked about in Thailand, what we'll talk about later on in Pakistan, where again the military really holds sway over the government. In other cases we have in Syria, again, what was his name? Hafiz al-Assad ran the country from 1970 until his death in the year 2000. That's when his son, who's become rather notorious these days, Bashar al-Assad, took power. A weird backstory there is he was the second oldest son of the former dictator. Again, his older brother was supposed to be, again, the next dictator, but died in a car accident. So Bashar al-Assad was actually an optometrist in London, of all things, came back to become a brutal dictator. So life takes us down weird roads sometimes, right? But he's run the country ever since. He's at the heart of the civil war we'll talk about in a bit. Ben Ali, who was the, president of Tunisia for about 30 years, something like that, was forced to flee the country back in 2011, but again, it was a one-party state from 1956 until 2011. Libya, again, beginning with a military coup in the late 1960s by this guy, Muammar al-Gaddafi, who also had to flee from office in 2011. But he ran the country as a dictatorship for, again, the better part of 4 decades. And finally, Egypt, we have Hosni Mubarak, who essentially was the president of this country from, again, I can't remember exactly, the late 80s, I think, until not that long ago. He was actually forced from power in a popular uprising. Egypt had democracy for about a year and a half or so, and since then the military has seized power again. So the current president of Egypt, again, al-Sisi, was the head of the Egyptian military. That's kind of a traditional thing in Egypt, where you have officially a civilian government, but almost all the military leaders have military ties. And again, it's largely, again, run from behind the scenes by the military. Iraq, again, had a military government from 1958 until 2003. The most recent leader of that military government, of course, was Saddam Hussein, who was largely placed in power by the United States because he was anti-communist and removed from power by the United States. So you have to memorize all these examples and get the sense that dictatorships, military governments, again, often, again, at the, assistance of the U.S., have long run all these countries. Any questions? All right, so again, the example's not so important, but you have a sense of these monarchies, these authoritarian governments running this region. That's been the traditional pattern here. Kind of the watershed event, and again, and sort of had mixed results, is the answer to your first question there, something that happened in the year 2011. So 2011 is the year the civil wars in Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen began, as well, not Tunisia, or wars in Libya, Yemen, and Syria began, as we'll talk about here in a bit. It was part of a major political upheaval that brought lots of political reforms to the Middle East, which is a good thing, right? The downside is it also sparked those 3 civil wars, all of which are still going on. And so we'll get to that here in a second, what's often referred to as the Arab Spring. We'll point out again a handful of countries that were democracies prior to 2011, right? So one is Israel, again, with a bit of an asterisk there. Israel's been a pretty clean democracy since 1948, provided you're an Israeli citizen. So if you're an Israeli citizen, again, they have more than one political party, as we talked about the other day. Little suppression of opposition voices from among the citizens, right? They have more than one political party. Clean elections, but of course, if you are an Arab Palestinian and not a citizen of Israel, you continue to be denied a political voice. So a bit of an asterisk there. Big asterisk hanging on this country, and that's Turkey, right? So Turkey, actually been for a long time one of the countries with the strongest democratic traditions in the Middle East, right? So this was set up going back to the 1920s with the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. But once again, it's kind of similar to Thailand, it's kind of similar to Algeria, kind of similar to Pakistan, where the military has always kind of been standing behind the scenes, right? So allow democracy to do its thing until democracy gets too messy and threatens the status of the military, then you have a military coup, right? So you can see on your notes there, you don't have to memorize this, but in 1960, 71, 80, and 97, you had a successful military coup, which had a failed one a couple of years ago. And again, so sort of democratic, but always that specter of military rule. The reason why, again, Turkey, if you recall, talking about the status of democracy on Thursday, is kind of sliding down that list of, again, free democracies, is largely the result of the current president. Right? So this is, again, President Erdogan, who came to power, again, a few years ago. And like a lot of rulers, the president-elect in Brazil, like a lot of, the president of Hungary, kind of, again, rolling back the clock as far as democracy is concerned. Still, he was elected, right? So, again, we can't exactly call him a dictator. He was elected, and is still a fairly popular figure in Turkey, but doing some stuff that is a little bit shady, right? So you don't have to, again, memorize this list or anything. But since August 2014, again, he began to crack down on any sort of dissent, right? So there was an obscure law that, again, nobody had paid attention to for 7 decades, where you could actually imprison somebody for insulting the president, right? Of course, for a long time, nobody took that seriously. He does, right? So if you publicly insult Erdogan, often find yourself thrown in prison. Shut down opposition newspapers. Again, there was a military coup that failed, as I mentioned a couple of years ago, and he used that as sort of, again, license to crack down on more dissent. So soldiers, judges, teachers, anyone who sort of questioned his policies found himself thrown in jail for, again, participating in this coup, including many people who had nothing whatsoever to do with it, right? So democracy is not looking so good in Turkey. Most recently had a referendum that greatly expanded the office of the powers of the office of the president, and it looks like those election results may have been rigged. It was a pretty close vote. So Turkey has long been a democracy, but it doesn't look like it's heading in the right direction as far as democracy is concerned. Any questions? All right, so we have, again, Israel, again, which is a pretty clean democracy, provided you're a citizen. Turkey, kind of heading the wrong way. And sort of the last two here, kind of a mixed bag of results. Lebanon was a democracy in its early years of independence. Unfortunately, it devolved into a civil war in the 1970s and 80s. Once the Civil War ended in 1990, it has been a multi-party democracy since, but with some corruption, with some violence for many years. Again, it was occupied by Syrian forces, so it's a democracy now, but again, the politics there are highly corrupt with lots of deep religious divisions. We'll get a sense of that in the video we'll watch at the end of class here today. So, again, big takeaway of all this, I know this is a lot of stuff, is that democracy at best in this region is relatively tenuous, right? We say the same thing about Iraq. The good news is back in what was the year there? In 2006, Iraq held its first free elections, and that purple index finger actually kind of became a symbol of Iraqi democracy. Because Iraq had never really been a democracy, they didn't have any voter rolls, right? So again, these voter registrations that democracies keep deciding who gets to vote and who doesn't, of course. They didn't have any of those, so the way to prevent people from voting twice is they would make you dip your finger in this purple ink, right, which you couldn't wash off for several days. So that meant if you went to the polls, you had to show them your index finger. If it was clean, you got to vote. If it was purple, you didn't get to vote. And kind of a practical sort of approach to the thing, which is kind of a good idea. But it became sort of the symbol of Iraqi democracy, the first time people were allowed to vote. Unfortunately, again, since 2006, there's been high levels of corruption in Iraq, and again, political parties still mainly based on religion. Right? Maybe a Sunni party, Kurdish party, Shia party, that don't really like to cooperate with one another. Once again, this is a lot of stuff. I don't expect to be an expert in Middle Eastern politics. Again, few people are. But again, have a sense that there have been democracies in the Middle East, but all of them have their challenges. Any questions? All right, so last thing here, the Arab Spring, I do want you to know what this is. You know, you don't have to memorize that big laundry list of, again, reforms that have happened then. But I kind of want you to have a sense of the Arab Spring, where it began, and sort of why it began, and then some of the results of it here. So again, it actually started in Tunisia. So back in 2011, I think this was a quiz question from last week, was it not? Yes, it was. Okay, so last week, we were talking about this very briefly here, is you had a protest that began in Tunisia, actually with one person, right? Now, I'm not recommending you do this, but again, it did spark this massive change in the Middle East. Tunisia was essentially, I mentioned earlier, a one-party state for many, many, many years, and just rife with corruption. I mean, loads of corruption. Essentially, that's how a lot of public officials, government officials, made their money, is by taking bribes. And there was a street vendor, a guy who wanted to sell, I think, vegetables on the street, and he was trying to get a license to do that, and he didn't have any money to bribe anyone, and so they kept giving him the runaround. So you go to one office to ask for, again, a permit to sell stuff on the street. They'd say, no, you're at the wrong office, go over here. Go to that other office, say, no, you're at the wrong office, go back there. And essentially just giving him the runaround until they gave him a bribe. And he finally got so frustrated, he actually burned himself to death in public in a form of protest. Which, again, I don't recommend you do, but that's so kind of the shock in the people of Tunisia, is they took to the streets and began launching demonstrations against the corrupt government, and actually forced the president from office, right? So again, just years and years and years of corruption finally galvanized the Tunisian people. They took to the streets. Ali fled from office. I think I mentioned the other day that Tunisia is actually sort of the one happy ending we have here. Yemen and Syria and Libya not so much. But ever since this happened in 2011, Tunisia's been a pretty functional democracy, right? One thing remarkably that's happened is, again, kind of the pro-secular military party and the Islamist parties have actually been cooperating with one another and sharing power, which is a crazy idea. So actually, less political discord in Tunisia here. So that's kind of the good news, right? If we can stop there, that'd be a nice thing. Unfortunately, a lot of other countries didn't turn out quite as well. But what happened in Tunisia soon spread to the rest of the Middle East, and you had these massive demonstrations throughout this region, probably the most visible of which was in Egypt, where hundreds of thousands of people turned out in public, protesting the military government, demanding political reforms and free elections and so on. And then soon this spread through pretty much the entire Arab world, and even beyond that a little bit. So I do want you to have a sense of what the Arab Spring is. It began in Tunisia as a protest against corruption, soon spread across a lot of this region. And maybe the big takeaway I'd want you to have is this list right here, these two lists right here. Maybe make note of that again, why people were protesting back in 2011 is some of the stuff we've been talking about, right? So by these long-standing issues, I mean things that have been around for decades, these have been brewing for a long time, upsetting people, and essentially it's the lack of democracy, right? So again, we've been talking about a lot of dictatorships or absolute monarchies and these one-party democracies, which of course aren't really democracies. Just people who wanted a political voice, again, getting more and more frustrated they didn't have one. Anytime you have dictatorships or monarchies or one-party democracy, of course, you get lots of human rights violations, right? So if you challenge the authority of the status quo, people get arrested, people get tortured, people get executed. And of course, if you have one political party, there's no check on corruption, right? So again, these parties were horribly corrupt. Oftentimes the understanding being if you were hired as a civil servant, how you made your money was by taking bribes. Lack of freedom of speech, again, this kind of grinding entrenched poverty in the Middle East. The fact that the gap between the wealthy and impoverished was growing. So maybe you have a sense of that, right? So these protests didn't just fall out of the sky. It didn't just happen out of nowhere. There have been issues all along. But sort of what sparked it eventually is just the economy kept getting worse, right? So unemployment kept going up, food prices kept going up, and so this increasing frustration, these new frustrations, added to these old ones, kind of sparked this Arab Spring back in 2011. And by the way, it's called the Arab Spring. That's a play on, again, the Prague Spring, which took place in Czechoslovakia back in the 1960s. Again, student uprising that happened there. Again, for lack of better terms, some journalists dubbed this the Arab Spring, and they kind of stuck. And this all kind of played out in 2011. Now, this next list, you're going to finish, so I'm not going to ask you directly about any of this stuff on exam 4 or anything like that. But I do want you to have a sense of it. It's a fairly impressive list, right? These are all the major political reforms that happened in the wake of the Arab Spring, right? So again, a lot of, leaders agreed to resign after the term was over. Some resigned immediately. They agreed to hold new elections. Algeria suspended a 19-year-old state of emergency, which was a martial law for nearly 2 decades. Saudi Arabia agreed to expand local democracy. Local elections allow women to vote for the first time in history, right? So again, we'll talk about some of the ugly bits of this, the wars that broke out in Yemen and Syria and Libya. We'll talk about the unsuccessful revolution in Egypt in the long run. And so, of course, it seems like we're kind of looking at the downside of all these things. But again, you don't have to memorize this list, but again, have a sense that some pretty important things did happen in the wake of the Arab Spring. It did lead to real honest-to-God reforms that actually benefited lots of people. So next time you feel like taking to the streets, you can actually maybe accomplish something. Question? Yes. So we got to look at the positive things here. I don't want to be the negative ones there. So again, I'm not going to ask you directly on any of that stuff, but there were some significant reforms that happened in the Middle East. So a lot of those issues, so the war in Yemen and the war in Syria and Libya, we'll come back and talk about after Thanksgiving when we look at some conflicts in the Middle East. We're going to finish up today, though, essentially looking at, again, two places, right? Kind of getting a sense of what's going on there. So we'll start off here looking at Iran, kind of get a sense of the political system there. We'll finish off back in Israel and Palestine, kind of look at the issues there. Once again, it's always kind of, again, big picture, right? So what is Islamism? How does Iran's government work? How has it sort of played out in Iran here? We'll talk about kind of current issues there, and then finish off again with Israel and Palestine. Any questions? All right, so Islamism, we talked about again a couple of classes ago. This is essentially a movement in a lot of Middle Eastern countries to try to establish religious law in these otherwise secular states, right? And it's something we pay a lot of attention to. So anytime you see an Islamist revolution happening anywhere in the Middle East, it gets a lot of attention around the world. The thing is very few of them have actually been successful, right? So you've had attempts at Islamist revolutions in all those countries you see listed there. So Syria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, Algeria, Iraq, and Morocco, and none of them have been successful, right? So the sort of goal of the Islamist movement is to establish theocracies, where essentially you have religious rule and religious law, again, replace these secular governments which have dominated the Middle East for a long time. And it's only been successful one time, right? So in all this time, there's been one successful Islamist revolution, and that was in Iran. And so that means that Iran is really the only true, honest-to-God theocracy in this region. As we talked about before, in a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, Muslim leaders, clerics do have a tremendous amount of political power, but they don't actually run the country. Right? So Iran, I do want you to know that, definitely for sure, that Iran is the only, again, successful Islamist revolution that's happened in this region, and the only true theocracy in the Middle East. Questions? Right. And really, outside the Vatican, the only true theocracy anywhere on earth. Right? So the backstory for this is it begins with the Shah. Right? We've talked a bit about the Shah of Iran, a terribly, terribly, terribly unpopular man who, again, wars, we'll talk about wars. Right? So the Shah of Iran, again, who, again, was deposed from power back in the 1950s, only to be reinstalled by the United States, again, against the wishes of the Iranian people, something they have not forgotten, of course. And eventually, though, his support began to erode so much that he was forced from power in 1979 by several different groups. He was pretty much hated by just about everybody except for the wealthy elite. So there were nationalists who wanted to establish essentially a Republic of Iran, establish again a nation state. There were communists who wanted to again create a communist state in Iran, and there were Islamists who wanted to create a theocracy in Iran. So actually several different groups here that were responsible for ousting the Shah, who fled to Egypt and died a few years later. But the most sort of successful group were the Islamists. Right? So the Islamists were able to bring back kind of the spiritual leader of the revolution, again, Khomeini, whose title, his first name is not Ayatollah. Ayatollah is a title meaning, again, a supreme religious leader. But the Ayatollah Khomeini, again, who was in exile in first Britain and then France, returned in the wake of this revolution, assumed command of the revolution, and very quickly began to crack down on all those nationalists and communists who participated in the revolution, right? So sort of three elements of the uprising, again, led to one element, the Islamists seizing control, and established a theocracy, right? So again, how things work in Iran is they do have a civilian government, right? So we talked a bit about the other day, we'll talk about it more here in a bit, is there is an elected president of Iran, there actually is a parliament of Iran. They do hold elections, which are actually relatively fair elections, and they have a civilian government. They conduct the day-to-day affairs of the country. That said, ultimate authority rests with these guys, right? So these are Shiite clerics who form the, again, I've heard it translated different ways, but essentially the Supreme Council, right? Muslim clerics. And they do a few things, right? One is they control the courts. They also control the military, which is a fairly significant thing, obviously, in this region. But most importantly, again, in that civilian government, these clerics determine who is eligible to be a candidate, right? So again, if you want to run for president of Iran, you have to put your name, submit your name to this council of Shiite clerics, and they determine if you're eligible or not. Right? If you want to run for parliament, you have to submit your name, and they decide if you're eligible or not. They can ban, again, any political party they feel like. So pretty much any center or left party is pretty much banned. They only allow for right-wing parties. So we'll talk about moderates here in a bit, but even moderates in Iran are pretty conservative, right? So that's what a theocracy is, right? So again, they do have a civilian government, they do have, again, elections, but essentially these Shiite clerics control the country, and of course from the military. And it's been that way ever since 1979. Any questions? All right, and last thing, again, we're going to go through this, and we'll talk about some, again, increasing divisions in Iran here in a second. So it's like, again, we've talked about several times this semester, this is a lot of information, but it's through the big story, right? Much like the one out on the side is North Korea's nuclear program. Give you lots and lots of information about that. It's essentially about this pendulum that kind of swings back and forth in North Korea, right? Where they try to rejoin the world community, suspend their nuclear program to get aid, military and economic aid, and they swing back the other way, start building nuclear weapons again, right? You kind of see the same thing that tends to happen in Iran. and has since 1979. It's sort of this tug of war between moderates who kind of want to rejoin the world community and trade more and interact more with other countries, and what we call hardliners who want to essentially isolate Iran from the rest of the world. And this has been going on really ever since the revolution in 1979. Right? So back in the 1980s, it swung kind of more to the hardliner side. So again, Iran became very isolated in the world. Actually, Time suggested again Iran versus the world. You know, think about the 1980s and where Iran was, how few friends it had. Right. So again, on one side, of course, the Soviet Union is not a huge fan of Iran because, of course, the Soviet Union, about 20% of the country's population were Muslims. And the Soviets always were terribly afraid that an Islamist revolution in Iran would spill into Central Asian republics and cause a civil war there. Right? So the Soviets did not like the Iranians. The United States did not like the Iranians, of course, because if you know much about this revolution, it ended with, again, not only our guy, the Shah, getting deposed, but again, a whole bunch of Americans in the U.S. Embassy being held hostage for 444 days. So the United States not a big fan of Iran because of that reasons. So Iran had kind of that weird distinction of being one of the few countries in the Cold War that neither the Soviets nor the United States liked all that much. Right? So the Iranians were isolated as part of Cold War politics. Again, other complicated things. Iran is also a predominantly Shiite country and otherwise predominantly Sunni region, so that kind of isolated them. They're not Arabs, right? In the Arab world, therefore, the Saudis, the Iraqis, and so on distrusted them. And of course, most Middle East dominated by these secular military governments who were terrified of having their own Islamist revolution, right? So a whole big long list of reasons why the rest of the world did not much care for Iran. So it was kind of on its own for about 10 years or so. And some Iranians are just fine with that, allowed Iran to conduct its own business free of Western interference for the first time in a long time. But unfortunately, it also allowed them to, again, crack down on any kind of dissent, right? So again, Iran was also ostracized for lots of the human rights abuses and torture and executions and so on. And their economy began to slowly crumble, right? It is one thing, again, we're going to quickly discover, again, if things go the way they are going, is that the countries really don't do well if they don't trade with other countries, right? So with all the sanctions placed on Iran refusing to trade with certain countries, their economy began to slowly but surely crumble. Right? So in the 80s, things not going so well, so that pendulum swung from the hardliner side back to the reformist side. Right? So in the 1990s, again, Mohammad Khatami was elected president in an absolute landslide. Now, he was a Muslim cleric, so he had the approval of that Supreme Council, but a fairly progressive guy as far as Iranian politics goes. And what he wanted to do was sort of, again, build more bridges with the rest of the world. Kind of, again, scale back human rights abuses. He wanted to, again, allow for more freedom of expression to a degree, right? Allow for more freedom of, be able to say what you want to, write what you want to, read what you want to. Just, again, more personal freedoms. Again, broad popular participation in government. He was a really popular guy, especially among young urban Iranians who were, again, college educated and wanted more freedom of expression and so on. And a pretty popular guy. He ruled Iran through the 1990s, began to improve relationships between the Iranians and the rest of the Middle East, between the Iranians and Europe, and Iran and the United States. And then the wheels came off, right? So this is one of the things that, again, will make you feel about politics one way or the other. But probably a big mistake made by, again, the President of the U.S., George W. Bush. This is rather infamously the Axis of Evil speech. So if you've heard about this thing, it was a while ago. This was after 9/11, so it was after the 9/11 attacks when, again, the Bush administration was trying to ramp up public support for the invasion of Iraq, right? And we'll talk about that more later on. But one way he did that is to convince Americans in a speech to Congress that there were 3 countries out there that essentially represented this axis of evil, which were out to get the United States. And we have that second quiz question there. Anybody know what these 3 countries were?
Iran.
One's Iran, obviously, yeah. Iran? Iraq, right, so he's trying to get approval for the invasion of Iraq. And another one, not actually in the Middle East.
Afghanistan.
No? What's that?
Afghanistan.
Not Afghanistan, that's a good guess. Not Afghanistan. It's actually North Korea. That's North Korea was the third party axis of evil. So if you have trouble seeing that, it's Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, right? So these were 3 evil countries. And again, as far as the governments go, they had a hard time arguing that, right? At the time. And again, Iraq, of course, again, this is the country that George W. Bush wanted to invade, so he's trying to convince Americans that Saddam Hussein was evil, and in bed with Al-Qaeda, which was, of course, not true. But threw Iran in there for good measure, right, so to again, sort of vilify them. Well, unfortunately, again, again, depends on your perspective. Again, people would say this was a good speech because it did, sort of, again, give him a carte blanche to invade Iraq. But this was probably, again, something that really, not probably, it did sour relations between the Iranians and the United States. To kind of get the sense of where Iran was at the time, they were sort of, again, becoming more progressive, more open to the rest of the world, making lots of reforms and so on. The hardliners were losing power, the moderates were gaining power, and then suddenly the president of the most powerful country on earth calls your country evil, right? That did not sit really well with the Iranian people, who, bear in mind, again, back in 1953, had their government overthrown by the CIA. So the suspicion of the United States that a lot of Iranians had pretty much again exploded in the wake of this speech. And again, right after this speech happened, there were elections in Iran, and they elected this guy, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was the very, very conservative mayor of Tehran, as the new president of Iran, right? So pendulum swing back the other way, and Iran was run by, again, a hardliner government for about the next 12 or 13 years. And essentially, again, basically reversed all of those reforms that Khatami had made back in the 1990s. So it began to, again, tighten restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Again, women's rights and minority rights, again, which had actually done fairly well, progressed quite a ways in the 1990s. All of those were rolled back. Activists who were students and, again, rights activists were arrested. Again, began to oppose any American policy in the region, and rather infamously, repeatedly called for the destruction of the state of Israel. Right? That's something that Ahmadinejad, anytime something didn't go his way, said the Israelis rule with them. Right? Actually hosted an academic, in quotes, academic conference where every Holocaust denier on earth was invited to Tehran to basically explain how the Holocaust never happened, that kind of a thing, right? And pledged that Iran was going to start developing nuclear weapons, right? So this is something that is the pendulum kind of swinging back the other way, and probably not a good way. But essentially the same thing happened, is Iran became more and more isolated from the rest of the world. Again, there were embargoes and sanctions placed on Iran because they pledged to develop that nuclear weapons program. And once again, we swing back the other way, and the current president, if you're looking for it, knocking out lots of quiz questions all at once here, Hassan Rouhani was elected back in 2013, right? And essentially, he's sort of in the mode of Khatami we talked about back in the 1990s, to introduce a lot of political reforms, to again expand, end human rights abuses, to expand, popular participation in government. So we're still kind of, we're in the reformist mode for a while, trying to build bridges to the international community. Of course, Rouhani here is the sort of the guy behind the talks in 2015, where Iran would agree to suspend its nuclear weapons program in exchange for the easing of sanctions by the international community. So this is kind of where we were in 2015. So Iran sort of rejoined the global community. They have a major agreement with the West to end those sanctions, provided they end their nuclear program. And so that's where we were as of 2015. And now we're kind of swinging back the other way. So again, it's a lot of information. I have the sense that Iran, about every 10 years, seems to cycle back and forth between reforms by moderates with the moderates, and again, sort of this backlash by hardliners. Okay, so to finish off here, to give you a sense of the sort of current situation in Iran, and there is a real, so again, right now we're sort of swung to the moderate side, have ever since 2014. It appears there are forces kind of trying to tug it back the other direction. So I bring this up because, again, oftentimes I'll talk about countries as if they're people. Is Iran wants this, Saudi Arabia wants this, Israel wants this. But of course, countries are not people, right? They're made up of a lot of people who often disagree with one another, just as we have here, right? So in Iran, there is still this major division between, again, moderates and hardliners. And a lot of this came down to that nuclear area, right? So again, a lot of hardliners in Iran, it's kind of an odd thing, right? Hardliners in the United States were furious about that nuclear deal. So were hardliners in Iran, actually, right? Because again, they didn't want to make this deal with the West, wanted Iran to have its own nuclear weapons and so on. And so it's kind of the showdown, right? So again, moderates, again, these political moderates tend to be most popular among voters for the most part, and again, have the broad support of a lot of, especially the urban educated population in Iran. The hardliners, on the other hand, have the broad support of religious conservatives and people living in rural areas. They still dominate the military, they dominate judicial posts. So again, it's kind of this big tug of war between the civilian government and, again, the military and the courts, right? So essentially what the moderates want, right? So the moderates, these are led by President Rouhani. They want more judicial and political reforms. They want to normalize relations as much as possible with the United States and other countries. The idea is that if you build better relationships with the rest of the world, you're going to have more economic progress, right? So essentially there you have Rouhani, the reformers, trying to, again, reform the country, again, open up personal freedoms, build bridges with the rest of the world. Then you have the hardliners who, again, very much dominate the military, right? What they want is to essentially, again, burn those bridges in many ways, especially with the United States, right? So the military, the courts, and a lot of, again, the Supreme Council we talked about earlier, again, argue that the United States is always going to be an enemy. Again, they control the media, which is, again, state-run media in Iran, which is a constant sort of 24 hours of nothing but anti-American, anti-Western propaganda. Again, their fear is that, again, that the United States is the enemy, but also, again, this is how politics often works, is if people start to feel safe, right? So again, if a lot of Iranians start to think, hey, maybe the United States isn't trying to destroy us, right? Maybe Europe is out to get us. Maybe the rest of the world is not such a bad place. Who does that threaten? Well, that threatens the military regime, right? So again, those who are in favor, kind of the hardliner approach, often they want Iranian voters to think the world's a very scary place because it keeps them in power. Now, Iranians will always want a big, strong military as long as they're fearful of the United States. Does it make sense? All right, so this is how politics works out. It's not fun, but it's true, right? Also the fear that, again, this is kind of a weird thing. The hardliners, if, again, the rest of the world starts easing sanctions against, again, Iran, what that means is foreign investment might come into the country, and that will threaten the economic dominance of these hardliners who largely control the economy. So it's kind of a weird thing to contemplate, is that the hardliners often don't really want what's best for the country, right? They want what's best for themselves. And again, that's having a big military, again, having themselves control the country. By building bridges with the rest of the world, that threatens the control of the hardliners within the government, and become pretty serious about it, right? So again, you can see here, began to arrest a lot of artists and journalists on really pretty questionable charges. Again, Iran actually executed 753 people in 2014, again, often without trial, the charge being that they were an enemy of the revolution, which again, because they control the courts and the military, they have every, again, political ability to do. The civilian government can't do much about that. And again, a big crackdown on Western influences. Again, Western media was banned for the most part in Iran. And also kind of this weird situation, again, going from a very serious thing to a not so serious thing, is in Iran, because they have long had sanctions placed on them by the international community, Iran doesn't really pay attention to copyright laws. So if something's popular in the rest of the world, there's always an Iranian version of it somewhere that's abusing that copyright and, again, sort of symbols and so on. So this is Iran's version of what? If you get a good look at that, that is. What's that? KFC. That's KFC, that's Kentucky Fried Chicken. This is, of course, not licensed by, again, the brand is always KFC. This is an Iranian knockoff, but again, here you see notice from the Iranian government that this store has been banned because it promotes Western values. Right, so again, KFC, I guess, is the bastion of Western values. But you see, again, it's sort of this tug of war going on between the moderates, who want to, again, join the international community and impose reforms, and, again, the hardliners who, again, don't want that to happen. Does it make sense? That's a lot of information. I apologize, maybe a little bit too much, but in a sense that, again, all countries often have these two elements sort of playing tug of war within this. Are there any questions? Okay, the last thing here for today, and again, we'll get all the way through. I mean, now we have another video to watch here in just a little bit. Talk about, again, Israel/Palestine. So we're doing kind of part two now. So we talked about this back during historical geography, not talking about the context of politics. So we brought it up in 1948 when we were doing historical stuff. We'll take up where we left off here. And this is with, again, what the Israelis would call their war for independence. So the 1948 war, where Israel, again, did indeed assure its independence. So the backstory here, if you recall, is that the UN solution was to have two countries, right? So you'd have a Jewish state known as Israel, you'd have an Arab state known as Palestine, and both of these groups that claimed all of this region would share it with one another, which neither found acceptable. Right? So if you recall, the Palestinians and most of their Arab Muslim neighbors, again, the joke is that, again, Israel is the United States' 51st state. Right? They view this as a form of American and European colonization. Totally unacceptable thing. In the same regard, they'd say, maybe recognize the fact that the Jews might have an historical claim to this homeland, but they're gone for 2,000 years, their lease is up, is basically how they would view it. Much in the same way, then again, if say, Native Americans try to impose their, again, property rights back on the United States, we'd say, yeah, okay, sure, but that's not practical anymore. That's kind of how the Arabs feel about the presence of the Israelis. These are European American colonizers. The Israeli state's completely unacceptable. The Israeli point of view is God said this is ours, right? So again, we inherited the promised land, again, according to God's covenant with Abraham. We did not choose to leave here. We were forced to leave here by the Romans. We're reclaiming what is rightfully ours. So both sides can be intractable about, again, either side's claim. So again, the Israelis were not happy with this because they don't think the Palestinians have a right to this land. The Palestinians not happy. They don't feel the Israelis have a right to it. So pretty much war broke out almost immediately, right? So again, the Palestinians, with the support of their Arab Muslim neighbors like Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria, again, declared war on Israel effectively. The Israelis were ready for this. They were, again, a little bit better prepared. And not only did Israel survive, but it actually increased its territory. So it gobbled up a lot of territory that was to be part of Palestine. Again, it's maintained the territory that was dedicated to Israel. And so essentially when that war ends, Palestine ceases to exist, and it never really has as an independent state. Two things thrown in here. You have, again, two bits of territory here. The Gaza Strip, this area in red, which is this little kind of stretch of land here, barren coastline, that was occupied by the Egyptians, right? So this, if you go back one, you can see was supposed to be part of, again, Palestine. The Egyptians occupied that. Then the bigger chunk of territory there in the west, what's known as the, in the east, what's known as the West Bank, called so because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River, that was occupied by the Jordanians, right? So there are two bits of what were to be the Palestinian state controlled by Jordan and controlled by Egypt. This is where an awful lot of Palestinians fled after the 1948 war. So if you're a Palestinian who'd been living, say, here in the southern part of the country, you did not want to live under Israeli rule, so you flee to Gaza, flee to the West Bank, and that's where a lot of Palestinians to this day are concentrated. Other questions? All right, now we can do a semester-long course on this. A lot of stuff that's gone on since 1948. But we'll give you kind of the major points here and get a sense of what's been happening since then. Again, date's not so important, name's not so important, but kind of big picture stuff. Again, how's gone down, all right. So one little side note, I don't have it on your notes there was a brief war in 1956 called the Suez War. Bottom line is Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, this important shipping lane between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. That canal had been owned by the British and the French, right? And the British and French decided they were going to invade the canal zone and take it back. They did so with Israeli assistance, right? You don't have to worry about that for the exam, it's not in your notes, but I throw that in there because this was the first major war between Egypt and Israel, which is going to be sort of a recurring theme here we'll talk about as we go along. So the Israelis and the Egyptians from 1956 on had not gotten along well anyway, they definitely didn't get along well after that moment. Another important event that happened though in 1964 is the establishment of something known as the PLO, that's the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was headed by, again, Yasser Arafat for many, many years. I think you're looking at that for, number 3. So Arafat will do A-R-A-F-A-T. So Yasser Arafat, again, was the lead. What's that?
How do you spell it?
Arafat's right there on the notes, right? So A-R-A-F-A-T. So Yasser Arafat becomes the leader of the Palestinians. Essentially, again, back in 1964, kind of depending on your perspective, so that the term liberation, again, if you're a Palestinian, you view these guys as freedom fighters. Right? They're going to liberate Palestinians from this Zionist control, this Western control, and so on. Of course, the PLO is labeled by Israel and most of the West in the United States as a terrorist organization for many, many years. So one man's freedom fighter is often another man's terrorist, as they say, and that's sort of what the PLO was, right? And to be sure, again, their primary goal, in fact, the PLO charter in the very first line calls for the armed destruction of the state of Israel, right? So again, that's liberating Palestine from Israeli control. That was the job of the PLO. So it was a militant organization to begin with, and run by Yasser Arafat for many, many, many years. But again, because the Palestinians did not have actually an official political voice, right? So you think about this, if you're the United States or you're France or you're any other sort of the United Nations, and you're trying to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate, well, the real trick is Palestine doesn't have a government because it's not a country, right? So you have to have somebody to serve as the official voice of the Palestinian people. Ultimately, it was decided the PLO would be that voice, right? So even though it remained labeled a terrorist organization until the 1990s by the United States and Israel, it was officially recognized by the United Nations as the official sort of government in exile of the Palestinians from '74 until the 1990s. So it was based in the West Bank for a while, and then in Jordan, and later on in Lebanon, and finally in Tunisia. So they had to bounce around a bit. This became the official voice for the Palestinian people. I bring that up because they'll come back in here in a bit as a major role player in the attempted peace process. Any questions? All right, effectively on that, look at again a couple of major wars that sort of set the stage for what's happening in the Middle East today. One I definitely want you to know about is have some sense of what happened during the Six-Day War in 1967. Now it's called that because in fact it lasted 6 days. Right? So, but this sort of again set up the modern map of again Israel and Palestine, and really set up the path toward again resolving a lot of conflicts in this region. And it actually had a very kind of strange beginning in the Middle East, right? So again, and it's still kind of shrouded in mystery exactly what happened during the Six-Day War. But essentially Egypt and Iran, which hadn't had a good relationship since the 1956 Suez War, again, we're sort of again rattling the sabers a little bit, right? And what happened in 1967 is Egypt had ordered the UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula, the triangle of land you see right here, a little close up. So this is again part of Egypt, right? It borders Israel here. After the Suez War was over, when the Israelis and the French and British were fighting against the Egyptians over the Suez Canal, again, ever since 1956, again, for about 10 years, this has been occupied by UN peacekeepers, right? So the peacekeeping troops have been occupying the Sinai, patrolling and so on. Well, in 1967, again, Egypt ordered the peacekeepers out of the Sinai, right? And essentially that's sort of a provocative move for Israel. Also, again, Egypt decided they were going to shut down the Straits of Tiran, punish Israel for its role back in that war. So again, if you are Israel, this is bad news, right? So Israel essentially has two options in terms of importing and exporting off the world's oceans. Anything that's coming in from the Indian Ocean, therefore from South Asia, East Asia, from Japan, something like that, essentially has to come this way. Right? So it comes up the Red Sea, goes up the Gulf of Aqaba to the southern tip of Israel. That's how Israel gets stuff from that side of the world, right? It can't use the Suez Canal, of course, because any ship under an Israeli flag would not be allowed in by the Egyptians, right? So the car's stuck there, they can't use the Suez. Their only other option is to use the Mediterranean, but of course that's going the wrong way if you want to go toward the rest of Asia. So the Strait of Tiran here was always a very, very vital shipping lane to the Israelis. But what the Egyptians did is they put a bunch of cannons, right, a bunch of artillery, on the, again, Straits of Tiran and threatened to blow up any Israeli ship that went in or out of the strait, right? That effectively, of course, closed that down to Israeli shipping. So they ordered UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai. They have, again, closed down the Strait of Tiran. And then on a fairly regular basis, the Egyptian military started running training exercises across the Sinai Peninsula, right? Again, these mock invasions of Israel, they were running just in case they ever decided to invade Israel. So Israel's effectively on high alert, right? They closed down the Straits of Tiran, they ordered peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula, they're running all these military exercises. Now, history has shown us that Egypt actually had no intention of invading Israel, that was never in their plans, but they wanted the Israelis to kind of be on the defensive, right? They kind of wanted to flex their muscles in this region, and so they were doing that basically, right? What actually, again, started this war is still a bit of a mystery, right? Is effectively, as we'll get to here in a second, Israel launched a preemptive strike on Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, so essentially attacked all three of those countries. Again, the Egyptian narrative, the Jordanian Syrian narrative is the Israelis just wanted to invade and they did that, right? Sort of Israeli narrative has always been that the Soviets were behind this, right? Is the story goes that the Soviets, and there's evidence this actually happened, leaked faulty intelligence to the Israelis, right? So you have again sort of this back channel Cold War weird kind of again stuff going on, where Soviet intelligence informed Israeli intelligence that the Syrians, Jordanians, and Egyptians were massing on their border preparing for an invasion. Now these are the days before spy satellites, so the Israelis really had no way of confirming that was true or not, and so they were pretty convinced an invasion was coming. And lo and behold, the Egyptians just happened to be running one of these training exercises right up to the Israeli border, just so the Israelis get this information. Right? So the Israelis thought, okay, this is true, right? They're going to be invaded. So they launched this again, in quotes, preemptive strike. It's an attack on three of their neighbors to prevent that invasion from happening. Now, again, a lot of Arabs believe that backstory about the Soviet intelligence is nonsense. The Israelis made that up so they could, again, legitimize their invasion. But however it started again, it did end in just 6 days with complete, it's just total Israeli victory. For example, the Israelis destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force while it was still sitting on the ground. That's how quickly all this went down. And again, not only prevented a possible invasion, but tripled their territory in 6 days. Captured a lot of territories, we'll look at here in a second. The most monumental thing about this is that the Israelis captured the Temple Mount, which was a very, very big deal. So they invaded Jerusalem, captured the Temple Mount. The Western Wall, we talked about, the most sacred site in the world for the world's Jews. Just as, again, a lot of Americans, mentioned a lot of Iranians will remember where they were when Operation Ajax happened. Americans, it's the Kennedy assassination, the 9/11 attacks. For Israelis, it's this, right? Any Israeli who was alive in '67 was exactly where they were the day they heard on the radio that Israeli troops were praying at the Western Wall. So this is a very big deal. Capturing it under Israeli control for the first time in 2,000 years. So it's a pretty big deal for them. Not such a great deal for their Arab neighbors, right? So this is the map after the 1967 war. So the Israelis seized control of the entire Sinai Peninsula, including the eastern side of the Suez Canal, which actually closed that down, right? You can't run a canal unless you control both sides of it, right? So the Suez Canal was shut down. Israelis control all the Sinai. They seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai from Egypt, seized the West Bank from Jordan, and seized a very strategic bit of territory known as the Golan Heights up there in Syria, right? So this is the origin of what's known as the occupied territories. Excuse me. And to this day, again, the official definition of Israel's boundaries are, again, the original state there, right? These are known as the occupied territories. So Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights are not legally territory of Israel, right? They've controlled them more or less since 1967, right? So the significance of some of these, again, the West Bank, of course, including Jerusalem, without question, again, the most important game for Israel back in 1967. But beyond that, actually, Israel gets a lot of water from the West Bank, which is actually a fairly important thing as well. The Gaza Strip, the Sinai, not terribly important for Israel, except that it's kind of a, basically an FU to the Egyptians, which they were not too unhappy to do. The Golan Heights is actually a pretty strategically important place. Right? So it's many suggest the Golan Heights is a high spot between Israel and Syria. When the Syrians controlled the Golan Heights, they actually were able to actually lob artillery shells if they wanted to down on Tel Aviv, right? By having the Israelis control it, they could actually hit Damascus from the Golan Heights. So this gives an enormous military advantage to the Israelis from 1967 on. Question? All right, and again, this is a great day for, again, especially conservative Israelis who retake the Jerusalem, retake the Western Wall. This is, again, a nightmare state for the Palestinians, many of whom had to flee the occupied territories into Jordan, into Egypt, into Lebanon, again, in terror from the Israelis who were now taking over. So the Palestinian situation was bad to begin with. It's much, much worse after 1967. Question? All right, so these are the occupied territories, and again, this is definitely one I want you to know. Is, again, maybe put brackets around again. Once about the '67 war in general, definitely kind of know these. Make sure you know that what those territories are, those occupied territories, and also again, UN Resolution 242, especially that phrase right there, land for peace, right? So this is a UN resolution. So the UN had a bit of difficulty with this, right? So this is sort of a problem they had made by coming to participating in it. Now they're trying to figure out what to do with Israel now it's occupying all these territories. Right? Now what UN Resolution 242 did is it actually required Israel to return all the occupied territories to the countries that had been controlling them before the war, because in the United Nations Charter, right, it actually, one of the very big prominent sort of, again, rules in the UN Charter is no country can gain territory through war. You buy territory, but you can't gain it through war. Of course, the UN came along after World War II, so it kind of makes sense. And we've got Japan and Germany. They would want to have that to be, again, a key sort of element of the UN. So it does call Resolution 242, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in recent conflict, right? So that's one, right? So it does require them to do that. Number two, though, this is the big asterisk that goes along with this, is again, because Israel's neighbors did not recognize their right to exist, the United Nations has said that Israel can continue to occupy these territories until peaceful relationships with their neighbors are, again, put together, right? That's a real kind of, again, sort of tricky statement there, right? So essentially saying, okay, all these territories you gain, you can't keep them, right? But you can occupy them until you develop a peaceful relationship with Egypt. So again, if Egypt again recognizes Israel's right to exist, then Israel will give back the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, right? If Jordan recognizes Israel's right to exist, then the Israelis give back the West Bank. If Syria recognizes the right to exist, you give back the Golan Heights. But until they do that, Israel can continue to occupy those occupied territories. So it's a tricky kind of thing. Again, they did that there in 1967. But it established this land for peace formula, right? That's still largely seen as the roadmap to peace, right? So again, what the land for peace formula says is that Israel gives up land in exchange for peace. Right? So the notion is that if you're Egypt, right, and I'm Israel, I'm controlling the Sinai Peninsula, you want it back, let's swap, right? You get the land from Israel, right? In exchange, you give Israel peace. You recognize our right to exist. This has been, again, a roadmap to peace ever since 1967. Make sense? All right, so that's all fine and good and kind of a good idea. Pretty much Israel began to violate that agreement almost immediately, and this is also another big contentious issue in the peace process here, are the Israeli against settlements, right? So the settlements is a name given to these settlements, right? These little micro cities built in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights. Israel started to do this in violation of international law immediately in 1967, right? And again, this is again an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. This is highly illegal. Again, the United Nations has condemned this many, many times over. But the reason they're doing this, as I think it was Menachem Begin, but is they want to create facts on the ground, right? The notion is you occupy the West Bank, you strike my there and talk, you move thousands of Israelis in the West Bank, you make it that much more difficult for again the world that will force you to give it back, right? So if UN Resolution 242 is all about the Israelis handing this territory hopefully over to the Palestinians or somebody else, this is a pretty good indication they never intend to do that, right? So again, they began to build thousands of settlements there. You get my facts on the ground, meaning again, if you have lots of citizens there, it makes it harder to force them to leave, right? So again, this has been a contentious issue ever since 1967. Any questions? Okay, so that is again what happened in 1967. The last kind of big international war between Israel and any of its neighbors, right? We had a few instances in Lebanon, of course. Was the Yom Kippur War. Right? So this happens in 1973. This is when, again, Egypt and Syria decided they were going to take back the territories they lost in 1967. Jordan had essentially had enough of this by this point. The Jordanians sat this out. Jordan has kind of secretly built actually a pretty positive relationship with Israel ever since 1967. But the Syrians, they wanted to go on the Heights back. The Egyptians definitely wanted the Suez and the Sinai back, right? So this is a surprise attack, right? So this time around, it was the Egyptians and the Syrians who launched the surprise attack, trying to recapture the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Initially did make significant gains. One reason they did this is kind of like Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas, right? Kind of to take the British by surprise by attacking on a holy day. Again, Yom Kippur, the same thing, that's the Jewish Day of Atonement. So again, they knew a lot of the Israelis would not be prepared for this on that high holiday. So you invade, but the Israelis, as it turned out, were actually fairly well prepared for it. So not only did they, again, prevent the invasion of their own territory, but actually were able to push Syrian and Egyptian forces back beyond the 1967 borders, right? So Israel held the Golan Heights, and again, Israel, again, held a good deal of the Sinai Peninsula. Incidentally, this is not something you need to memorize, but again, this guy became a national hero during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. This guy named Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently the Prime Minister of Israel, so again, he became famous back then. The story is in 1973, is that the Israeli forces were able to surround the entire Egyptian Third Army in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, and there was about to be a bloodbath when, again, international community brokered a peace deal. The Canadians actually did it, right? So convinced them to launch a ceasefire. And after 1973, again, Israel and Egypt agreed that the Israelis would pull back from the Suez Canal and allow the Egyptians to reopen it, right? So this is sort of maybe the first movement toward peace. Ironically, it began with a war on a holy holiday. But again, it did lead to the Egyptians regaining the Suez Canal in 1975. All right, any questions? All right, so yeah, maybe about the last. We'll talk about a few more things here, and then we'll watch that video. is, again, the Camp David Accord, right? So this is sort of the first major stride toward peace in the Middle East. This begins in 1979, and a great example of the Land for Peace formula, right? And the backstory here is also kind of an unusual one. One of the strange things to go on this part of the world here. It actually started with an American journalist, right? So again, if you're looking for it, it was this guy. Remember who this guy was?
Walter Cronkite?
Walter Cronkite, so C-R-O-N, Cronkite, Walter Cronkite will do. Again, sort of put this in context, Walter Cronkite was the anchor of the CBS Evening News, and again, was known as the most trusted man in America, right? Keep in mind, back in 1967, there were 3 channels, right? So you didn't have 24-hour cable news, you didn't have, again, 50 different options to look up your news. You had the newspaper and TV, right? Usually people watch one. CBS, again, was by far the most popular broadcast. So again, about half of Americans watch this guy's show every night. It's a little half-hour show. That's when you got your news, from half hour in the evening. And so again, this was sort of the face of American journalism and that idea. To his credit, Walter did a very positive thing. He actually flew off in the 1970s to Egypt to talk with Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at the time, and ask him again, why do you refuse to recognize the existence of Israel? Why won't you even sit down and talk with the Israelis? And to Walter's surprise, or the world's surprise, Sadat said, I'd be more than happy to talk with the Israelis, right? So Walter, being the good journalist he was, hopped on a plane, flew off to Tel Aviv, sat down with Menachem Begin and said, Sadat just told me he's willing to sit down and talk with you. Would you ever talk with him? And Begin, everyone surprised, said, sure, I'll talk with him, right? So odd enough, again, journalism kind of saved the day. So Walter Cronkite, since he was responsible for, again, sort of sparking the Camp David Accords, eventually the two sides met in Camp David, which is the presidential retreat in Maryland, and came to terms, right? So 1979, again, if you're looking for a bit of good news and all this mess here, was brokered by the United States, kind of started there by Walter Cronkite. By the way, again, fueled by lots and lots of U.S. aid, right? I don't know if this is still true, but I know for many, many, many years, the #1 foreign recipient of U.S. foreign aid was Israel, the #2 recipient was Egypt. Right? So again, the United States did throw in a lot of cash here to make this a bit more enticing. But this was a pretty profound moment. So on the White House lawn, there's President Carter there, Begin and Sadat shaking hands, which was a shocking kind of thing for most people. But again, this is an example of the Land for Peace formula. The agreement is the Israelis would pull back from the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians finally decided Gaza Strip, and who gives a damn? So they kind of forfeited their claim to Gaza Strip. They just wanted the Sinai back. So they agreed to this phased withdrawal where Israel would withdraw from the Sinai, Egypt would gain control of it. So once again, that's land. That's the Israelis giving up land. In exchange, the Egyptians recognize Israel's right to exist. Right? So that's saying essentially legitimacy of that, again, old country, right? Israel there, that has a right to exist, which again sounds like a formality, but that's a profoundly important thing, because again, Egypt is by far the most populous Arab country in the world. So the leading Arab state has now made peace with Israel. That's a very strong sort of a message against all the other Arab populations, including the Palestinians. Okay? All right, so they say you can't make peace in the Middle East without Egypt, and that's definitely true, right? So again, Egypt, by agreeing to recognize Israel's right to exist, is a pretty profoundly important thing. By the way, this is something that, again, did not sit well with either the Palestinians or, in fact, with some Egyptians, right? So Anwar Sadat, who we saw back here, the man on the left there, again, the Egyptian president made peace with Israel, was assassinated about a year later by some of his own troops, right? So it was on a military parade. This was a reviewing stand. Some troops who were furious with him for making peace with Israel hopped off their truck and gunned him and about a dozen other people down on a reviewing stand. So some eerily similar things going to happen here a bit to an Israeli prime minister. Sadat paid a pretty dear price for this. And important always to remember, we talk about countries like their people, and it's not always the case. So just as a lot of Egyptians were perfectly happy that Sadat made peace with Israel, as many more Egyptians were furious with him for doing that, some to the point where they decided to kill him. Questions about it? Yes?
What was the question, number one?
What was it? I can't remember.
That was the
What?
year did,
2011, 2011. Question. All right, so that's how it's up, and there's sad in here. The Palestinians, so you kind of think about 1979, how the Palestinians feeling all about this. Well, they're ultimately feeling pretty damn betrayed by all of this, right? So Egypt, again, they're Arab neighbors, right? So again, Palestinians are Arabs, Egyptians are Arabs. And again, the Palestinians refuse to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And dear God, the Egyptians have gone away and again made peace with Israel, recognize Israel's right to exist. The Palestinians completely feel left out in the cold, right? So the Palestinians had always kind of had the hopes that the Syrians, the Jordanians, the Egyptians would be able to defeat Israel and allow the Palestinians to take over that whole country, right? Again, you don't make war or peace without Egypt in the Middle East is kind of the rule. So with the Egyptians out of the picture, the Palestinians think we have to take this upon ourselves, right? Again, the rest of the Arab world's not going to help us anymore. We're going to take this on ourselves. This is the beginning of the Intifada, unfortunately also known as the First Intifada, And this is the Palestinians essentially rising up against the Israelis in the occupied territories, especially occasionally in Israel proper. Sometimes as simple as, again, kids throwing rocks at Israeli troops, but again, bombings, assassinations, things like that. Again, this uprising and trying to kind of shake Israel. Again, and either destroy it, right, which would be an ideal thing from the Muslim Palestinian perspective, or at the very least, so, sort of force the Israelis to come to the bargaining table with the Palestinians by making them leave, basically. So this is a prolonged uprising from 1987 to 1993. And finally, we have another maybe happy ending, sort of, not really, is the Oslo Accords, right? This is something that, again, I was actually a freshman in college, and I did help damn all right when this happened. I was actually sitting in a geography class when this all went down, and the teacher had to roll the TV on the cart, right, this was back in those days, right? We actually watched this whole thing go down. It's kind of a shocking development. We found out that those crafty Norwegians have been behind this, right? So the reason it's called the Oslo Accords is the Palestinians and the Israelis have been secretly meeting in hotel rooms in Oslo and Norway, hammering out a peace agreement, right? Being the United States, of course, we took credit for it, and the agreement was signed in the White House lawn, but again, the Norwegians actually worked this out, because that's what Norwegians do. This is a classic land for peace kind of thing. So I do want you to have a sense of what we mean by land for peace. Just as the Egyptians had, again, gotten land from the Israelis, the Sinai, in exchange for recognizing the Israel's right to exist, the Palestinians now do the same thing, right? A land for peace swap here. So the Israeli commitment is that Israel is going to give up all of the Gaza Strip, so there's a strip of land there along the Mediterranean. That's going to be Palestinian territory, and parts of, not all, parts of the West Bank for a future Palestinian state, right? So in 1993, a long time ago these days, right, Israel had recognized the right of Palestine as a legitimate political entity and agreed that they would eventually get their own state, eventually being the key word there, right? This agreement also established the Palestinian Authority, which is effectively what had been the PLO, now recognized as a legitimate government with Yasser Arafat as its head. Right? So going to give up land again to the Israelis, agreed to end the construction of all Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, which was a significant thing, and return some land that had been confiscated from the Palestinians back in 1948. Right? So essentially, the Israelis handing over land to the Palestinians. In exchange, right, the Palestinians give the Israelis peace, right? So Yasser Arafat, of all people, right? So Yasser Arafat, who had long been the face of the PLO, right? Again, considered a terrorist by Israelis and by Americans, again, who had written that PLO charter, calling for the armed destruction of the state of Israel, signed an agreement recognizing Israel's right to exist, which again sounds like a formality, but it's a profound thing. So the sight of Rabin here, the prime minister of Israel, shaking hands with, again, Arafat, would have been a shocking thing, and it's still kind of a shocking thing for a lot of people in 1993. But the Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist, and also agree that they're going to end the intifada, which is kind of a key thing. So again, that's the other part of the peace thing, is the Palestinians now will be responsible for cracking down on Palestinians, which is a tricky kind of an idea, but something that Arafat was willing to do. So. Questions? All right, so now we have a land for peace swap between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We have, again, a Palestinian state. And again, when I was sitting there back in the class, I thought, wow, a couple of years there'll be a new country called Palestine on that. Of course, that hasn't happened. And nearly similar to what we talked about earlier on is, again, a lot of people oppose this process, right? So right-wing Israelis were absolutely, again, beside themselves, again, the side of their prime minister shaking hands with the terrorists, right? The Palestinian terrorists, as far as they were concerned, infuriated lots of Israelis. On the other side, the idea of Arafat shaking hands with an Israeli prime minister infuriated lots of Palestinians. So opposed the peace process, right-wing Israelis and Hamas, which is a militant organization that broke free from PLO control and still calls for the armed destruction of the state of Israel, were very, very upset, right? So going back to this picture, some Israelis very happy with this, they made peace with the Palestinians, some Palestinians very happy to make peace with Israel, but a whole lot of Palestinians pissed off at Arafat, a whole lot of Israelis pissed off at Rabin for making peace with the enemy. And again, the interior parallel to what we saw before, Rabin, who had agreed to this peace agreement with the Palestinians, was assassinated. Right? Just the same way Sadat was assassinated by an enraged Egyptian, again, Rabin was assassinated by an enraged Israeli. We saw him as having made peace with the enemy. Questions? Nothing's ever simple in this region, at the very least here. So that's sort of the good news. Didn't end well for Rabin, but it's kind of the other good news there. But you can kind of get a sense of where things have gone since then just by looking at the next heading there, and that is the second intifada. Right? So again, all that sort of goodwill and hope we had back in the mid-1990s, thinking finally we were on a road to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, pretty much began to break down. Right? So you have to memorize those dates there, but maybe have a sense of how things began to sort of fall apart here. Basically, again, from the 2000s on, again, ironically, Rabin, the peacemaker, his assassination ushered in more of a right-wing government in Israel. Again, Arafat eventually is going to die, of course, in his leadership, again, that power vacuum means there's a divide within the other Palestinians. And the bottom line, again, the main takeaway is that hardliners, and by that, those who refuse to make peace with the other side, they pretty much increasingly control both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So maybe know that. Again, what began to happen is those sort of agreements back in the Oslo Accords. There had always been kind of three sections of the West Bank. There was Zone A, which would remain part of Israel, Zone C, which would become part of Palestine, and Zone B, which was up to further negotiation, right? None of that ever worked out. So the Palestinians began to demand more territory they hadn't been promised in the Oslo Accords. Israel actually refused to give up some territory they had promised to give up in the Oslo Accords, and no independent Palestinian state evolved. Right? It never evolved here. So, frustration with this, there were renewed uprisings in the occupied territories, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Israel always, again, responds with pretty blunt counterattacks, right? So, it's one of those things, I think we have a tendency as humans to look for a good guy, bad guy kind of thing, and certainly Hamas killing Israeli civilians, you can never agree that that's a good thing. On the other hand, Israel killing Palestinian civilians in response, that's never a good thing. So, this is really sort of ceased to be a good guy, bad guy kind of a thing, it's just these revenge killings basically going on there. Eventually, to make matters even more complicated, the Palestinians fragmented into two ultimate governments, right? So Hamas would eventually seize control of the Gaza Strip, right? And this is the current situation to this day. So Hamas governs the Gaza Strip, and Hamas, again, is against the peace process. Fatah, which is the political descendant of the PLO, is the party that controls, again, the Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So they're actually two separate, again, divided factions, even among the Palestinians. So if you're going to get the Israelis and Palestinians to agree on anything, you have to get them on the same page, and they're certainly on the same page at this point, right? And again, if you follow the news, things have just gotten worse and worse and worse. So Hamas kept launching rocket attacks at civilian and military targets in Israel. The Israeli response was to bomb the living hell out of Gaza, and again, it's just nothing good any way around. So again, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of an idea. And really, ever since 2015.
Idea, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just ever since 2015, just more and more violence. Essentially, again, Palestinian extremists attacking Israeli soldiers, who then respond by bombing some section of Gaza. So it's just violence leading to violence leading to violence. This has happened just over the last couple of weeks. There's been more violence in Gaza. So again, that is terribly depressing, right? So again, in 1993, we had the perfect sort of happy resolution to all of this, and it just kind of never came to be. As far as obstacles to peace, there are more than a few of them, but we're getting close on time here, so we'll stop talking about that last little section and come back on Tuesday. So, yeah, I hope you ruined your Thanksgiving, but that's been question. All right, before we take off, watch another clip from the Bourdain show. If this video player will work. If not, I'm going to throw it simply with this summer I was taking to Lebanon, so if you're around on Thursday, right? What we're looking at is, again, Bourdain returning to Lebanon a few years after, again, he had been there with his crew in a war with that. So I'm trying to go back and revisiting some of the people he had known back in 2006, and the people who had been there. Again, as always, kind of get a sense of the sights and the sounds. Actually, a pretty good narrative about why, again, Palestine, why Lebanon has been the sort of front of so many foreign relations over the years. But the last clip is going to give you an idea that, from people all over the world eat the same food. So just give it a look. Once it's done, you are free to go, if indeed it is.
About 45 minutes north of Beirut, up the Lebanese coast, just over a mountain range to some beautiful beaches which stretch the length of the Lebanese coastline. Young Beirutis make this drive almost every weekend in the summer to chill out, catch some waves at places like this, a beach club called Pierre and Fred. Maybe you remember this guy, Ramsey Short. He's a journalist. His dad is British, his mom Lebanese. Last time I saw him was in 2006, sitting across from me at a late-night shawarma joint, as overhead the jets were already beginning to come in low, getting ready to unload on the airport. When we left, he stayed.
Last we saw you, I think, was the night they started to unload on the airport.
Yeah, it was a nerve-wracking time.
So, okay, so you stayed.
I stayed. It was tough.
Why didn't you leave? Weren't your family and friends in England concerned?
Yeah, the scale of it happened so quickly, and I looked around and I could see all the people who couldn't leave. Lots of my Lebanese friends had no recourse to get out of here. Once the roads were blocked to Syria, it felt like a betrayal for me to run away, and it was scary, because I remember we were talking about how everything had started happening in Lebanon. I was editing Time Out, bars, people, life, shops, everything was happening, people were talking about it. It had really reached such a great point of recovery, and then this happened, so it's taken a real long time. And now, everything's happening. But you do live with that risk that anything can happen in Lebanon.
So it's such an enchanted and historically important piece of real estate, and yet, man.
Yeah, so much blood has been spilled. Families broken up during the Civil War, and everyone has a story. Anyone you meet will have a story.
Beirutis have always been relatively welcoming to people fleeing bad situations elsewhere. This has led on one hand to a lot of problems, to the fact that thousands of Palestinians live here in refugee camps,